These are not dead or wounded soldiers being pulled out of the battlefield. They are alive and well, and in fact heading into combat while lying inside torpedo shells. Then there was the flying platform to get soldiers high up in the sky. I mean, why slide when you can fly? And finally, the first aircraft that could both hover like a chopper and fly like an airplane, except no one dared to fly it. Here are some inventions. During World War II, General John O'Daniel, the commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, came up with what he thought was an ingenious idea. Torpedoes captured by Italians were cut in half and attached to form sleds to pull 12 soldiers behind a tank. O'Daniel called them battle sleds, and they were to be used to transport troops into heavily defended positions. Instead of running behind a tank, an infantry squad could accompany the tank without being exposed to small firearms, is similar to the armored sleds of the Red Army, where a single sled could carry soldiers over snow, and also be used by 3 or 4 people to take cover. But O'Daniel's battle sleds had more functionality. Soldiers were pulled forward in the paths made by the tank's tracks, which would eliminate the risk of stepping over anti-personnel mines. Most importantly, in an area with tall bushes, they could be transported into the battlefield without being noticed. One soldier in the front could simply pull a release wire, which would detach the sleds from the tank, allowing soldiers to remain hidden until they ambushed the enemy. Even though all 360 sleds produced saw battle in 1944, there were some problems. Rough terrain and ditches made the ride impossible, and the failure of the release mechanism in some instances made the battle sled not reliable. These issues and the introduction of armored personnel carriers forced the battle sleds to slide into history books. But why drag soldiers inside sleds on the ground when you could make them fly? In the early 1950s, the U.S. Army was looking to develop a flying machine to be used as a reconnaissance platform, where soldiers could quickly rise up for observation and even shoot at the enemy. But there was a problem. At the time, the U.S. Army didn't have the required government permits to run its own aviation development programs. So the project was overseen by the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research. This is why some prototypes were marked as U.S. Navy and some as U.S. Army. With funding from the Army, the Hiller Aircraft Company developed VZ-1 Pawnee, which first flew in 1954. The platform's innovation was the duct surrounding its counter-rotating propellers. The air drawn over the rim of the duct provided 40% of the aircraft's thrust, with the remaining 60% is created by the propellers inside. The steering was also revolutionary. The pilot could simply lean to one side or the other in order to move the platform in that direction. But after evaluations, the U.S. Army considered the platform to be impractical as a combat vehicle. It had limited speed and could only fly with help from ground effect, which meant it could only fly so high. But the VZ-1 wasn't the only vertical takeoff and landing craft with counter-rotating propellers that the U.S. Navy was involved in. Before the invention of short takeoff and vertical takeoff aircraft like F-35s and Harriers, the U.S. Navy was interested in a propeller-driven fighter aircraft that could be launched from a small warship. The result of their cooperation with Convair was XFY-Pogo, a delta-wing propeller plane, powered by a turboprop engine which would fly and land on its tail. It had counter-rotating propellers, so that the engine wouldn't turn the airplane instead. Being an unusual experimental airplane, no pilot wanted to risk flying it. But a Convair engineering test pilot and Marine Reserve officer, Lieutenant Colonel J.F. Skeets Coleman, volunteered for the job. He had to use a special ladder to get into the cockpit and then sit in, facing the sky. Pogo's first test flight happened in August of 1954, when the airplane only took off vertically, hovered about 20 feet off the ground, and landed back on its tail. This was the first free vertical takeoff in history, done by a fighter plane. But the first conversion from vertical to horizontal flight took place 3 months later in November of that year, with over 3,000 officials watching intently. This was the first flight ever, in which a pilot flew both aerodynamically and in a hover. The most difficult part was landing Pogo. Once back in a vertical position, the pilot had to rely on the helicopters flying nearby as a guide to adjust his rate of descent, and had to look over his shoulders to spot his landing, which he managed to do perfectly. Around the same time, the U.S. Air Force was experimenting with something similar, a VTOL jet aircraft. It was called X-13, which would take off while hanging from a platform, could then switch from vertical to horizontal flight, and then hang back onto the platform. The X-13 had a maximum speed well below Mach 1, just like Pogo. With more testing, even though the concept was proven to work, it wasn't quite feasible for a variety of reasons. For instance, the pilot had to look back behind himself during landing to properly stabilize the aircraft, which could be accomplished only by the most experienced pilots, not to mention the risks of landing Pogo on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean. On top of that, regular fighter jets had top speeds that approached Mach 2, and Pogo, with a top speed below Mach 1, was at a great disadvantage. So only 2 years after its first flight, Pogo was cancelled. None of these inventions are in use today. But if you think any of these, or any other old prototypes, can be adapted to today's warfare, we'd love to read your comments. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to Wonderful Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.